Welcome to the webinar tonight. The topic is resolving back pain. It's a familiar one for a lot of people at various times in their lives for various reasons as well. And it's one that is very ambiguous for diagnosis because there's a lot of different influences that this can potentially be about. People tend to think that it's just about lifting heavy things that causes you to have a sore back or injure yourself in such a way, but there are a lot of preliminary catalysts, we could say, that will contribute toward either the strength or weakness of the back, and we're going to go over some of those tonight. Now I'm just going to minimize the video so that it doesn't sort of get in the way of the presentation. Just admit a few more people as we go along. And if you have any questions along the way, feel welcome to put those on the text chat. I'll check it from time to time, but mostly keep my attention on the webinar itself. So this evening in the webinar, what we're going to address is the 4 primary areas of influence, and they're listed below. That's the musculoskeletal elements or physical elements, gastrointestinal and circulatory elements, neurological and psychological elements, and subtle energetic elements. These are the 4 primary areas that you'll find can influence this issue of back pain. So after we've gone over those details, I'll explain why a holistic approach is needed to address this, how to efficiently integrate the elements involved, and at the end there I'll give a little bit of detail relating to our Wellness in Motion Holistic Back Pain Resolution program that we will make available at some point in the near future. All right, so the 4 primary areas of influence, here they are. We're going to begin off with the musculoskeletal elements, which are physical elements that most people can relate to, and then go deeper into this issue as we get on. So here we are here, muscles and bones, right? So these can obviously be work-related. For example, obviously, if you are someone that works in a field where you are laboring and having to lift up things, then certainly that's going to have an influence on your back depending upon how you lift it and of course the volume and load that you are lifting. I'll go into further detail as we go in relation to that. This can be related to stiffness due to immobility. So if you're someone that sits down quite a lot, particularly if you're in a seated position in the chair, then as I'm going to detail shortly, that's going to significantly alter your posture and the tension ratios of your body to bring about this issue of back pain that so many can relate to, right? Stiffness relating to overuse as well. Like I mentioned in relation to physical labor, if you have a repetitive movement that you're doing, such as this person here is demonstrating in the picture, the laborer with the pickaxe, obviously if you're swinging it and you can see his back is bending there, flexing right along the longitudinal axis of the spine, it's going to end up overloading the low back. So these are kind of obvious things, and we're going to progress through to the less obvious things to give people a bit of a list to look at and compare to their own situation. So by the time we get through this webinar, we will have probably identified the situation that is influencing yourself or someone that you know with back pain. So another primary influence is of course posturally related. So we've got a kind of generic image over here of someone with a good posture standing up nice and straight. There's sort of a line can be directed straight down through the ear, the shoulder, the back, the hips, the knees, the ankles. Whereas with this one here, it's a generically indicated bad posture, isn't it? With this slouch, or what is called kyphosis, forward angled head position, forward shoulders, and of course you get an increase of tension through the low back, which I'm going to detail in more, get into more detail shortly. So this posture related issue can be due to atrophy. Most of the time when we're sitting down at work, it's not that you're sitting down perfectly arranged like this image here, right? This is an ideal situation, as if there can be such an ideal thing in a seated position. But it's normally that, no, there's going to be different influences such as the screen position, where your head is angling forward, thereby placing more tension down your back. You could be, sit forward in your seat, causing yourself to slouch. That's very typical. If you start to get uncomfortable, change your position. You could be just leaning over and relaxing. And this is the typical position, isn't it? Where you start to get tired from sitting upright and you just give in to the demands of gravity. Your back releases and you end up, your chest gravitates toward the floor into that classic slouch position. So when that takes place, significantly, the muscles up the rear aspect of your back, called the spinal extensors, they switch off. And as we're going to look at shortly, when they switch off, your abdominal wall also switches off, right? So these spinal extensors attach to all of the vertebral pieces with the ribs attached to them. Particularly, these are called the thoracic extensors. And when they shut down, your whole rib cage is therefore dropped in its position. Chest descends toward the floor. So this is what happens to your posture when that happens. Here's the person standing up nice and straight. That's a good posture, isn't it? So say your thoracic extensors switch off. This is what happens. You get this rounded back position. The shoulders tend to go forward. The head tends to go forward as well. And your abdominal wall shuts down. Now, when this area of the body shuts down, what you get is compensatory tension in this area here. This is called your lumbar spine. It's the vertebral pieces below the rib cage. And this is typically where people feel back pain. Sometimes people do feel it up higher in the mid back and even neck as well, but quite often it's the low back that people can feel it, right? So if we zoom into this area, here's the lumbar spine here. We've got L1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 here. Let's take a look more deeply at what's really going on when you shut down that area due to compression. So here's our lumbar vertebral column, our 5 lumbar vertebral pieces. Here's our intervertebral discs that are in between the vertebral column. And what happens is that when you've got spinal compression, because of the aforementioned reasons, then these spinal pieces get squashed together like that. Now, if you can imagine, that compression is obviously going to squash the nerves that are coming out of that area. And as you can see, there's a lot of them, aren't there, that come out of this spinal junction, this lumbar and solar plexus, as well as the sacral plexus down a little bit lower. So that's the problem, is that when that compression squashes the nerve, you feel pain not only locally in the low back, but also it descends down the leg and interferes in function down further, such as sciatica, which is very common as well. So let's take a little further look at this. Here's our woman in muscular form. I'm going to turn around so we can see the rear aspect, and we're going to zoom into this lower area, the legs and the glutes, just to have a look at how imbalances can relate to this as well. So I'm going to just highlight this area here called your hamstrings. You can feel that if you're sitting down, presumably. Squeeze your underside of your leg with your palms and your fingers. You can feel that big fleshy muscle group at the back there, the hamstrings. These are often very tight for almost everyone, really. Unless you practice a lot of yoga over a long time, you're going to have tight hamstrings. And let's just flip it around to the side here. So we're talking about this aspect of your leg. It's very significant in relation to back pain and spinal dysfunction in general. So I'm going to flip it around this way so I can incongruently show you an image of a male now that's going to be demonstrating the movement. It was the one that was just available whilst I was looking for images. So say that you are bending over in a typical way like that. This person's gardening. It could be that you're picking something off the floor. At any moment of the day, if you have to get something from down lower, you bend forward, don't you? Now, what happens when you bend forward is that this muscle, the hamstrings at the back of the leg, actually has to lengthen to allow your pelvis to rotate over. So if it doesn't, because it's tight, what you get is a compression of tension here, and the pelvis is kind of locked in what's called a posterior pelvic rotation. That means that your low back or your spine has to flex more, and your low back ends up taking a lot of the tension, or the load, we could say, right? So this is significantly why people over a longer period of time build up this tension and end up with back pain, as I've just been reviewing in relation to neurological impingement and blockage. So let's look a little further about specifically what happens with the biomechanics. Here's our person as a side-on view. Here's the pelvis. And when you go to bend forward, such as that person was in the garden, to pick up something in front of you, here, if the hamstring here is tight, you can see it attaches to the back of the pelvis here, right? So it's going to be pulling down that way, which is going to rotate your pelvis this way, posterior pelvic rotation, right? And that's what results in this area, the lumbar spine or lumbar extensors, taking the load. So that's an issue, of course, for people that are seated down a lot of the time, because look at what you're doing here when you're sitting. Not only are your knees drawn up toward your chest, but of course your legs, typically either the feet are out front or directly below or in behind, aren't they? In any case, the position of the knee is flexed, so that means the hamstrings are consistently shorter, right? Now, when you have the knees drawn up toward the chest, that also creates a problem with another muscle group called the hip flexors. They attach from the top of the leg. I'm going to go into more detail with that shortly, and actually directly into the spine. So if your knees are drawn up, it's at about 90 degrees at the hip joint here, toward the chest, then what you'll find, of course, compared to a standing position, it's actually half as short, isn't it? Your hip flexors, half as short as they would be as if your legs were going straight down in a standing position. Now that creates another problem relating to tension and balance within the body, and that is that it pulls your pelvis forward. That's called anterior pelvic tilt. Can you see here, iliopsoas is the other word for hip flexors, is that it pulls upon your spine there and draws it down toward the connection at the top of the hip here. So can you see how if the hip flexors are pulling the spine forward, this area here is being compressed, isn't it? Right, so if we look at the anatomy of your hip flexors, you can more clearly see why this is a problem. Here is the distal connection or the lower connection of the hip flexors, and here is the proximal connection where it attaches into from T12, that's the lowest thoracic vertebral piece, see the lowest rib here, the floating rib, and then your lumbar 1, 2, 3, and 4, I thought it was 5 actually, but in this picture it's 4. You can see how that muscular connection to all of the vertebral pieces, if the tension from here to here is shortening, is going to create compression, isn't it? It's going to squash the vertebral pieces together, which is going to compress the discs, and often this is actually the problem that is causing pain and dysfunction in the area. So here's our little seated lady here, and the end result is that the compression causes pain in the low back, right? She goes to stand up from her seated position because the spine's squashed, then that action increases the pressure and you suddenly get that sudden pain where your disc is screaming out and saying, give me a break here. All right, now here's another thing to be aware of in relation to your posture. I've chosen a socio-politically sensitive picture here. Obviously, here's a pregnant male. Apparently they can get pregnant these days. Just joking. Now, the reason that I've chosen this picture, because he's got a protruding belly, and often cases, unless it's due to a large consumption of beer or food that's causing a lot of inflammation in the belly, which I'll touch on shortly, then this area here is often very weak, and that's related to the posture, which I'll talk about shortly. So this area here is referred to as the transverse abdominis. It's a muscle that attaches from the rear aspect directly into the spine and wraps right around through your abs. When it's functioning, it draws your belly in close. It's like a little corset that holds you firmly. So here's the anatomy of the transverse abdominis, as it were. All right, highlighted in blue here. They attach directly to here, what's called the abdominal aponeurosis. That's fascia that connects the two sides. And so the way that this works is, if you're sitting there, take your hands out in front of you and place them directly on your hips, like you're an angry mother telling off your child. Don't do that, right? So you've got your thumbs on the rear aspect of that pelvis. You can feel that there, right? And your fingers, an index finger, is going to be on the front aspect of your pelvis. So if it's like that, can you imagine, squeeze your fingers toward your thumb and you can feel your belly being drawn in, can't you? So that's the action of the transverse abdominis. Alternatively, you can also try just drawing your belly button in toward your spine, which is a cue often used in exercise classes. Draw it in. That's the transverse abdominals doing that action. So if this muscle is not functioning, one, your belly's going to protrude a lot, isn't it? And two, what I'm getting to here is that it's actually going to interfere in the function of the spine as well, and specifically what's called spinal stability. So if we take our pregnant man here and we're going to chop him through the middle, it's called a transverse section, and we're going to peer down upon that section from a bird's eye view. Imagine we're looking down and we're seeing what it looks like through that area from that perspective. All right, so here we are with our transverse section chopped through the middle. Here's the spinal piece here, the vertebral column. We have the lumbar extensors that we were talking about before at the rear aspect of the spine. We have the hip flexors here and here, otherwise known as the psoas major, that we touched on before, that connects into your spine. And then we have the internal oblique and transverse abdominals that I was just talking about. So the transverse abdominals here formulate the deepest layer of your abdominal wall. On the second layer, we have here the internal oblique. Now, the reason that these two are so significant is because you can see now, because of their position, if they contract and if these fibers become shorter, what's going to happen is it's going to draw the belly in, isn't it? Because these are shortening, so the distance between here and here becomes shorter, the belly is drawn in. That's the action of it. Now, this is the significance of it. See this highlighted area here, the green? All right, that's called the lumbodorsal fascia, and you can see how the transverse and internal obliques, they directly connect to that. And this fascia, which is like the stitching that holds your whole core together, it then moves through and merges directly with what are called the transverse processes of the vertebral column and posteriorly to the spinous process of the vertebral column. So when that tension is engaged, what you get is something called segmental spinal stability, which is absolutely necessary if you want to have a secure, strong spine that doesn't get caught when you bend over and lift things, for example, right? Now I'm going to show you more about that shortly. So when you have someone sitting down like this and they're slouching, and these extensors, specifically the thoracic extensors relating to the lumbar, the rib cage, if they switch off, then what you get is this area is also going to switch off. So let's have a look at that experientially. Just notice that the way that you're seated now, lift up your chest nice and tall, like you're standing proud, well, sitting proud rather, and just notice how your belly immediately becomes firm, doesn't it? So you can either even take both your arms directly out in front as you're holding that high postural position, like the chest being pulled toward the ceiling. And you can probably feel that your belly switches on even as you reach your arms out in front of you. Now, conversely, if you drop your chest down and go into a slouch position, make no effort whatsoever to hold yourself up with regards to your posture. Now with your fingers, feel your belly and notice that it's just turned into a kind of soft lump, hasn't it, with no tension. So obviously, that which I was just explaining about the transverse abdominals and the tension through the lumbodorsal fascia, that's completely switched off. You're not going to have segmental spinal stability. So it gives you an indication of the function of the spine in relation to the core and how important that is to keep your spine in really good health. So here's another thing that's significant in relation to physical things is simply poor biomechanics. Say, for example, this guy's demonstrating dropping off some wood, but some of you are going to put your bags down to the ground or lift them up. If you go and lift them in such a way where you are causing your low back to do all the work, as opposed to your glutes and hamstrings, for example, because they don't have sufficient flexibility, then of course your low back's going to take the load there. I kind of explained a little bit of that previously in relation to movement, didn't I? So anytime you're moving house or you're lifting a box or shifting furniture, etc., or even for some people because of the spinal compression, it can be something as insignificant as bending over and picking up your keys or wallet off the side of the couch or a table. It could be that insignificant, and it's the last straw on the camel's back, so to speak, that causes the disc to just get pushed beyond what's called its tolerance threshold, and you get that sudden jolt of lightning in your back, and you really know about it, but it's an accumulation of these components that causes you to get into that state in the first place, right? So here's a good picture of someone doing really what would be termed poor lifting mechanics. The legs are straight. He's bending over and using tension through the back to pick up whatever he's reaching for, and then boom, it causes a problem, right? So that's a short overview in relation to the physical elements or the musculoskeletal components. And now we'll go a little deeper into the body and have a look at this gastrointestinal and circulatory elements here that are, and as we move through this more subtle influences, you'll notice that it's not immediately obvious that this is causing a problem, but it is built up over time. It contributes toward it. Nevertheless, it can be the actual primary cause for a lot of people. So let's take a quick look at this. Now, the first thing that you notice about the gastrointestinal elements is that obviously it's directly related to the position or the location of your low back, isn't it? It's right in front of the low back there. So this can be caused by dietary related influences. If you have a look at these food sources here, what you can see is that these are all processed foods. You've only got literally one thing here, that's the lettuce on the hamburger or cheeseburger, whatever it is, that you would find naturally growing in nature. And all of these other things, the salted nuts, of course, roasted, salted, they've been processed as well, changes the fat content or the way in which the fats are expressing in the peanuts when you roast them. All of these other things, because they're not out of a garden directly or off a tree, they're not coming directly from nature, then they have a degree of interference in the natural molecular structure that they embody. And so when you place that into your belly, because your body's not used to dealing with that sort of food, it's relatively recent, in terms of our evolutionary development over thousands of years, that the body's not used to processing that. So it can kind of jam it up, creating all sorts of inflammatory issues within the belly, which increases the inflammation and swelling, we could say, the pressure upon your back, resulting in back compression, spinal compression, and nerve impingement. So needless to say, other areas such as your rich desserts, your creams is often, and dairy elements are often big problems. Dense and salty foods as well can contribute to this gastrointestinal disturbance. Oftentimes, although some meats you can get aren't processed, it's directly from the animal, oftentimes in modern society, it's been injected with various steroids, antibiotics, vaccinations, and so forth, that really just add an enormous chemical load into the meat, so that when you're ingesting it, it's not organic, it's not a whole food, it's significantly altered in its biochemical and molecular state. And once again, the body's not used to dealing with this sort of interference. And of course, we could look at the various deli meats. They are examples of processed foods as well. And so as we go through these examples, you just want to consider how many of these are part of your diet, because it all accumulates and contributes toward this issue, primarily relating to inflammation within the belly, right? So as I mentioned, another issue is dairy in particular. It's pretty broadly known that people get lactose intolerance, for example, very easily. That's an issue where you aren't able to digest the lactose, which is, in other words, the sugar in the room. Sorry, I'm just getting distracted a bit, entering someone into the room. You're not able to digest the sugar in the dairy because the enzyme lactase has actually been destroyed in the process that it goes through with modern processing methods. So the milk etc., is pasteurized, where it's heated up to a very high temperature, and this basically kills off the digestive enzymes that are otherwise needed to assimilate the lactose within your body. So it's like, can you imagine trying to put something into your body and then not allowing it to have what is actually needed for it to assimilate properly? It's no problem. It's no wonder that it's going to cause a problem, isn't it? So that's what's happening with modern dairy, unfortunately. Needless to say that people will have reactions to bread as well. Gluten intolerance is the common one, isn't it? So same issue there. It's your body's inability to process it, which can cause digestive issues. And it's a little bit like having a traffic jam in your belly. When you have this sort of thing going on, you've got a traffic jam and angry people shouting at each other and becoming enraged because of the congestion in the traffic. Well, that's really what happens in your belly when you have this irritation down there, because it's quite a complex situation in the belly. If it's not functioning well, you get inflammation, the traffic in that area becomes enraged, and that's how you get this inflammation, because basically the components start shouting at each other, right? So another thing that contribute toward this is poor circulation. And you've got a sort of general symbolic indication of the blood vessels coming down here, but they come down and actually come right through your digestive tract. So you can see these sort of general faded blood vessel type indications surrounding your intestine here. When your food comes down through the stomach and moves into the intestine, this is the major area where the nutrients are assimilated into your body. So what happens is that all these intestines are surrounded by blood vessels, and the way that the food gets from your stomach and intestines into the rest of your body cells is that the nutrients have to actually pass through the intestinal wall and into the bloodstream. So if you don't have good circulation, particularly in the area of the belly, but generally speaking around the entire body, then of course you're not going to be able to digest your food properly, are you? Now, that might not seem immediately obvious in terms of a negative impact upon your back specifically, but it will actually impact your back directly, because it will create that inflammation will interfere in the function of the digestion, creating swelling of the belly. And that swelling creates a lot more pressure upon the spine. So it's sort of an indirect influence. The other thing that's going to happen is that because your energy is lower, because you're not digesting your food properly, that's going to influence your mood. And of course, that's going to impact your dietary choices, isn't it? When you're tired, it's more likely that you're going to choose those sort of quick pick-me-up options that are often not the healthy influences. They're in packets, processed, etc. And you're adding more trash to your system, which further degrades the function of the system itself, which, as I said, contributes to inflammation, swelling, and then pressure upon the spine, etc. So another thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is often there's compromised digestion relating to not only enzymatic issues, but the stomach acid can be very weak as well. So you're actually having problems breaking down the food that you're putting into your stomach and your digestive tract because of the lack of those enzymes and stomach acid. So the other thing that comes up, particularly now in modern times, is there a lot more attention being given to the gut microbiome and also fungal influences within the system. So the microbiome of the gut is very intricate. And it's like the traffic example is a good one as well. You can easily put something down there that can react to your gut bacteria. And, you would have gone through school and science class, etc., and remembered perhaps adding different chemicals together and it creating a chemical reaction where you've got this sort of overflow of bubbles coming out the top of the beaker, that sort of thing. Put the Coke in with the ice cream and it sort of fizzes up, that sort of thing. So, if you put various different foodstuffs in there that we've generally just looked over, you can imagine that that's going to happen at some point where the two chemicals don't agree with each other. You get that frothing up or that chemical reaction within the body, and then that causes inflammation, which creates compression, which creates the nerve problems as well, right? So it's interrelated, it's elusive, and you often don't realize that that's the cause because you assume that it's actually just a physical thing. Oh, I've lifted something too heavy. It's not. It's much more than this, isn't it? You're welcome, Paula, for your comment. So let's continue here and look at the neurological and psychological elements. And again, I'm just really kind of breezing over these things very rapidly. Each and every one of these components we could really talk about for many hours. I'm just touching on a few key elements so that you, ideally, you can relate to this and go, oh, okay, my behavior actually, matches what you're describing. And you can start to identify what applies to you. At the end of the webinar, what we'll do is we'll send out to all the participants that checklist if Joe didn't already send it out, so that you can go through and just assist us to assimilate and sort of summarize this information as it relates to you in particular. So let's take a look at the neurological and psychological elements now. And again, as we move sort of across the scale to the right, what you find is that it's becoming more and more subtle, isn't it? Like musculoskeletal or physical elements is obvious. You pick something up, you've hurt yourself. Gastrointestinal, okay, I've eaten something and that's created disturbance within my belly and that's caused inflammation, which has upset my nerves. Okay, that's a bit more subtle, isn't it? You're going to have to be quite curious to pick that out. Now, the next level, neurological, psychological, you've thought of something and now that's impacting your back. So we're really starting to get reasonably subtle here in our evaluation of influences. Nevertheless, for some people, this could be a primary influence. So first of all, let's just look and see that it is really ultimately the neurological structure that's being impinged that's causing the problem. So you have spinal nerves coming out of your central nervous system, and when you get spinal compression, like I covered before, and these discs are being pushed downward, these ones are being pushed upward, causing them all to be squashed in between, the discs can sometimes then start to protrude out, and then this oftentimes will actually directly block the nerve, and that's the long-term issue. Here's the compressed spinal nerve, and stops it from working. And one of the ways that I use to sort of draw an analogy associated with this is if you're watering the garden with a hose, for example, obviously for you to get water to the flowers and provide the nutrients that they need, the stimulation and support they need to grow, to be healthy, the water has to get to the flowers, doesn't it? If you squeeze your hose with your hand, that's going to compromise the flow of water toward the flowers and they're not going to get watered. So likewise, your body's filled up with little vessels. Nerves are one primary vessel that carry actually electricity to the rest of your body to innervate it correctly. The other primary vessels are, of course, your blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. But tension and compression, like the hand on the hose, can inhibit or prevent the natural flow of energy that's supposed to be going along that vessel. And consequently, you get the blockage, which then results in the problem, in this case, spinal pain. But we're generally speaking to health here as well. It could be any health disorder within the body that's really being influenced by this kind of issue. All right, so here we have this man with the compressed spine, and it's because of the spinal impingement, isn't it? So posture's one element, as I've covered. Muscular tension ratios we quickly looked at, didn't we, with the hip flexors drawing this down, compressing here, squashing, as I've just detailed, the spinal discs, creating that impingement. And then now let's look at the actual psychological element here that can be causing this problem, which is directly related to the nerves, by the way. So here we have a man on the side here with his head, his hand on his head, worrying away about something. Now I want to give you attention to one of the primary physiological responses that your body has. It's known as the fight or flight response. Of course, you would have heard of this before as that. But what happens with the fight or flight response is it's your body's natural way of protecting itself. It's a survival response. And so I'm just going to go into a little more detail in relation to the physiology. You'll see here the various nerves coming out of the brain, that's called the cranial nerves, go to various different areas of the body, but particularly to the senses, right? So you have your oculomotor nerve here, your trochlear nerve, vestibular cochlear, I can't even pronounce that, vestibular cochlear nerve. Obviously I need to brush up on my pronunciation skills. But this relates to your inner ear, right? So in other words, when you're looking at things, when you're hearing things, the electrical stimulation that stimulates within your body directly, subconsciously impacts your nervous system, right? Through the cranial nerves, which directly work through what's called your autonomic nervous system. Now you can see how this is directly connected. And can I get something for you?
We've only got 4 boxes, like for the reformers. Do you know
Oh.
We've got 5 reformers, why don't we have 5 boxes?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I can't help you with that. Sorry about that. Little hello from the side there. We've got a reformer class going on next door, so I apologize for any noise in advance. But back to what I was saying about looking and hearing and feeling and sensing danger, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be danger, just something that's stressful to you. You've got a webinar that you need to deliver tonight that you didn't realize until yesterday, because of the school holidays. Something like this might create a stress response. It could be that you suddenly realize you've got to pick up your kids from school and it's like 2:55. So anything that suddenly impacts on you, either chronic or acute, which is in the now, immediate, is going to stimulate this fight or flight response. So what happens is that here, nerve impulses move down what's called the vagus nerve, here we go, specifically down to, you see, the belly here. And so that shuts off the blood flow to the belly. Other ones stimulate your lungs, for example, and your liver. So it mobilizes blood glucose, for example. It adds sugar to your blood. It causes you to breathe faster. Your heartbeat begins to beat faster. Your eyes begin to dilate. Your pupils dilate so you can take in more light. So these are all physiological responses relating to the fight or flight response, which cause your body to be ready for the danger, right? Now, the issue with this is if your body is having this fight or flight response often, then what's going to happen is you're going to have chronic contraction in your belly, aren't you? You're going to have a chronic inhibition of your natural digestive process as a result of that. You're going to have energy stores being constantly mobilized into your system. The heart rate's up because you're having to deal with the stress. Now, this is actually something that's going to directly impact on your back, and you may or may not have noticed before, if you've experienced back pain, that when you go into a chronic or acute fight or flight response, not only do the nerves in the belly get contracted, but also the nerves in the lumbar, the spine, because it's directly opposite your belly, isn't it? Your low back. The whole area gets shut down. So you get spinal compression simply because of your perception of the environment. Pretty interesting, isn't it? So whether or not you're going into an acute stress response, like I mentioned, something suddenly come to mind, oh, I've got to, make this payment, or otherwise we're going to get kicked out of the house, or it could be anything, couldn't it? It could be just my, my mother-in-law is coming over at the weekend and she's going to be judging the house based on how tidy it is. This could be enough to create the stress response, couldn't it? But it's all happening within the mind, and then that's causing the brain and the nervous system to respond, and subsequently the physiology, which can impact on your back. Interesting, isn't it? So one thing that can contribute to this significantly is just simply mental aversion. And now we're going into a little bit more peripherally how your mental state can actually impact on this. So say, for example, look at this stroppy looking character. You're at work and there's this person at work that you just can't stand because they won't stop talking about themselves. They're always looking for attention, complaining. They, take a day off whenever they possibly can. Whatever it is that sort of pisses you off, you develop this mental aversion. And then it actually starts to become a stress, doesn't it? Because the moment that you're exposed to the person, whether you're present with them, like at the moment, in the now, and they're actually in the room, or even your mind can go to the person and you begin to feel irritated because of your perception and response to them. All right, so the reason I'm raising this is that even that is a stress upon your system, right? And if you have developed mental aversions, or we could say judgments toward people within your environment, invariably there'll be someone within the household that this is happening with. If you choose to live with people, have a family, and certainly in the workplace, this is very common, isn't it? In your friend circle and social circles and so forth. Yeah, this can be an accumulated load that really impacts on your system. And yes, this can also impact on your low back, right? Now, let us move on to this final area of influence, the fourth primary influence relating to this issue, and it's the subtle energetic elements. And once again, as we continue to that right-hand side of the screen, it's becoming more and more subtle. We've just looked at the mind. You just have a thought, and that's impacted your back. We just looked at how that happens, right? Now, subtle energy, this is even more subtle, even more challenging to manage, right? So you can see why this issue of back pain is very elusive to a lot of people. So here we have our Eastern medicine acupuncture man on the side here, which is just sort of indicating to us, isn't there, that there's these subtle energy lines that refer to as meridians in the Chinese and Eastern medicine systems, and they're treated variously through acupuncture, for example. Cupping is another way that they use, as illustrated here on the left. And we're observing this because in the Eastern world, of course, in India, of course, for example, they call it prana. They call it the nadi, what the energy lines are called, not meridians, but in the Chinese system, they call it dantian. That is your energy centers, otherwise known as chakras in the Indian system, and meridians, energy lines within the system, right? So what most people are not aware of is that this subtle energy field or energy influences, which is really a light, a movement of light within your system. We are electromagnetic beings, not only physical. If there's a blockage within the flow of this energy, this can also impair the function of your physiology, which then causes a degradation of your body's innate response or natural functioning, right? So these energetic blockages can be the cause of various dysfunction and disease, but they can interfere in nerve function as well. So here's an example. Here in this location, this is referred to as your solar plexus chakra, or dantian. So this relates to psychosomatically. It relates to your inner power. So say, for example, you're at work and your boss comes over and starts accusing you of, not doing a good job and really attacking and laying into you, then that's what's called a tyrant-victim interaction, isn't it? Someone's attacking another person, the other one's receiving that attack. And so what can happen is if you are in a disempowered situation and you don't feel that you're able to change your working situation, this can also happen at home. Perhaps you're married and you've got someone attacking you about something. Because of finances and various other influences such as children, you might not be able to change your situation straight away. Now, that can cause you to feel an inherent lack of empowerment. In other words, you don't want to be there, you don't want to go through it, but you have to because you can't currently change it. There's an inherent victimization in that, right? Now, when you experience that, and I'm just talking about the solar plexus chakra because we can all relate to this to a degree, can't we? What happens is that it creates a blockage in the solar plexus chakra, which is like a constriction. Now, if you take your hand out in front of you, open up your fingers wide, and now squeeze your fingers all together into a tight fist. That's a constriction happening in the hand. So energetically, when that constriction happens within the solar plexus, it also happens in the cardiac plexus or heart chakra. It also happens in the sacral center down here in the belly, and the coccygeal plexus down in your sacral area as well. Sorry, the sacral plexus in the lumbar. Then what you find is that contraction, that hand squeezing together, you can imagine that's going to squash your physiology together, isn't it? It's like everything folding into a black hole in the center, and all of the mass, the cellular tissue, is drawn to the center, creating compression. So obviously, if we squash this area, the nerves that come out of that area are also going to be impinged, aren't they? That can be the cause of your back pain as well. It's quite ambiguous, isn't it? So the other thing with this issue of energetic blockages in the energy centers and energy lines is that it can really disrupt your endocrine function. So your endocrine function refers to your glands and organs that secrete the biochemicals that keep your body in balance, right? Everybody knows what it's like, particularly females, if you become hormonal, right? It really throws your mood out and disrupts how you're feeling, and that can certainly impact on not only your mood, but of course, as a consequence of that, what you're eating, right? Because mood, emotion, and diet are all interrelated, and as we've discussed and observed, your diet can significantly influence what's happening in your belly, which can create inflammation and thereby impact upon your back as well. So issue with these energetic blockages is that over a long period of time, let's take out the hand in front, squeeze it into a fist. That blockage, that constriction can actually prevent neurological function, so the way in which your nerves are reaching the organs, and also the way in which your blood vessels are delivering nutrients to the tissues as well. Now, you can imagine that that's going to create a problem in your body, isn't it? If your cells and your tissues are not receiving the nutrients from the food that you're eating, if you're eating, any healthy food at all, now, if they're not getting delivered to the building sites called the tissues so that you can achieve healthy cellular replication, can you see how that's inherently a process that will lead to disease and dysfunction, particularly over the long term? So all of these elements need to be considered if you want to resolve this issue of back pain. Not only that, but I think, we can all see that it's related to disease in general, isn't it? So now I'm just going to go over a bit of a sort of metaphorical analogy to illustrate why a holistic approach is needed to address this. So like holes in a bucket, if you don't address all of these elements, water will flow out the gap that is not being addressed, isn't it? And the problem will remain. Now, because the issues exit at different levels, and I'll illustrate this here with this bucket here. So we could look at the bottom of the bucket as what we saw as the musculoskeletal elements, the physical elements, right? The next level of the bucket, gastrointestinal. So it's going up the bucket. As we ascend, we go to neurophysiological, neuropsychological, and then we have the subtle energetic elements on the top there. So, you might get to the base there and, in other words, do all of the correct physical exercises and the correct physical stretches. And good job, you've established a foundation relating to the musculoskeletal or physical elements. That's a start. But can you see that if you don't have this area, gastrointestinal, addressed, if you've got a hole in the bucket, that's where your energy is going to be leaking out. That's where you're going to be creating inflammation within your system and still causing this problem of back pain. It's going to create digestive issues. It's going to create problems with your reproductive system because it's all in the same area, right? And moreover, it's going to create potentially problems all the way up and down your legs as well, because the nerves that exit the spine and the lumbar nerve plexus, they're the ones that go straight down the leg, right? So say we resolve that and we look at your diet as well. We're working our way up the bucket. We've resolved that. Now you've got strong musculoskeletal structure, flexible and maneuverable. You've got a nice calm belly because you've been feeding it gentle things that are agreeable to everything that's down there, including the microbiome and digestive juices and all that sort of stuff. And then we've got this level sorted as well, right? So that is to permanently resolve the psychological element. Then you go further up the bucket, close off those holes. In other words, we have addressed the elements within the mind that are causing irritation based upon your perception. Difficult stuff, isn't it? Because so many times a day that we see an annoying person and it becomes an irritation within our system. Nevertheless, regardless of our mental justification, if you're getting irritated, your system's responding physiologically, you get fight or flight response, and the rest has been detailed, hasn't it? So finally, if we can address the subtle energetic element and really deal with the energetic blockages, what you'll find is that your system completely transforms. What you'll find is that your mind becomes incredibly still and calm all the time, in spite of whatever various environmental stimulations that are irritating you or causing you to be, angry on a daily basis. So the benefit also in clearing up all of these levels is that you've not only resolved the back issues, but you've resolved all of your health problems, your bad habits. If you can overcome your judgments, wow, you're going to find that your relationships are going to bloom, and all the systemic inefficiencies associated with all of that have been resolved. You're going to have given yourself vibrant health and well-being. So the elements we're talking about here is not just about back pain, is it? It's about total health and well-being. And that is why this issue of back pain is so elusive, because it's actually about the total health and well-being of the person, not just about accidentally lifting something a little too heavy on Tuesday. So how to efficiently integrate these elements? Well, one way is that we can give you an assessment on a personal level and look over these components. You've also obviously got a bit of an indication as to what probably applies to you because of what we've just gone over and the additional checklist that we'll send out to you. But if we want to go over a particular physical assessment in terms of the way that you move and look at your musculoskeletal balance, like the first element that we talked about, to see the way that you pick things up, the way that you're holding your spinal position, is your TA firing, your transverse abdominis firing, etc. These sorts of things we can immediately look at and then prescribe specific exercises to resolve it, right? So in that way, you can identify what actually applies to you on an individual or personal level. And the next step to that would be to create an individualized plan that suits your own personal needs. So that would be including all of these potential components over here. They're all going to influence the elements that we just talked about, right? So it might be that you just want to deal with the first level of the pyramid to begin with. Just look at the exercise, general lifestyle balance, the nutrition and the sleep. If you can get the foundation right, you'll actually probably find 80% of the people that's going to resolve the issue. And then for the further sort of 20% or maybe a little more, might need to look into this mind element of mental and emotional. What's causing the emotional triggers? What's driving the compulsive eating of things that aren't good for you, but you just do it because you're trying to, survive. And the subtle energetic elements, they're even more elusive, as I mentioned, because it tends to elude the conscious mind, but we can address that as well. And the way that we do that is in our meditation class. So finally, we set that plan in motion and bring about definite results within a predictable time frame, right? If you are doing the right things consistently over time, there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that you will resolve the issue. If it's not resolving, it's simply because one of these elements isn't being addressed. And since we have the checklist, since we know what they are, we can go through them either ticking or crossing, can't we, to identify that. So a little bit of detail about the Wellness in Motion Holistic Back Pain Resolution Program that we'll be running here shortly from the studio and potentially online. Obviously, this is going to involve some exercise. Now, ideally, we can do that in studio, and that way we can deal with the musculoskeletal, but also neurological element by releasing tension through stretching and mobilization. We can release pressure on the nervous system and address it directly. And that way you have acute relief, immediate relief. You feel straight away better. You're building a stronger body. So you're sort of using it as a preventative measure. To address the other elements, that's a coaching thing, isn't it? Gastrointestinal, circulatory, well, that's addressed if you're doing a bit of cardio as well to a degree. But the psychological elements, where we look at what is really impacting your mind, what is really impacting your emotional state, what's impacting the way that you're choosing to put food into your vehicle, right? So these sorts of things we can look at more deeply if you're interested. At some point, we'll probably do an online option for that as well. And as I mentioned, the subtle energetic and psychological elements as well are very effectively addressed in the meditation classes that we run every couple of weeks or so here at the studio, right? So one thing as well that we'll be sending out to each of you to help you out immediately is this basic introductory program for back pain resolution. And I think it's only about maybe 20 minutes or so. I'll literally guide you through myself, show you the exercises that are going to most immediately relieve tension in the low back. You'll be aware the hip flexors, the hamstrings, the glutes, these are all primary offenders, as well as begin to strengthen up your core, the deep abdominal wall, the transverse abdominals, the internal obliques that we discussed earlier in the presentation. This program will help you begin to strengthen that from home. You can just put it on your tablet or screen and just follow it through, right? So I hope you enjoy that. And that's enough talking from me. You've been pretty much had a monsoon of information, haven't you? We had to get through it. So thanks for staying with us this whole time. I'm sure you've benefited from it and learned a lot from it as well. And what I might do is here, I'll just find the text chat here. And if you're interested, I think got the link there. That's the website link. If you're interested to touch base with us and potentially book in for, an assessment, or interested in the program relating to resolving these issues, then there's the link to the website. You can head down to the bottom of the page there, and there's the contact form there. Just write in your details and any notes that you wish to say, right? So thanks again for being with us tonight. Once again, the session has been recorded as well, so if you want to check over it again at a later point, just let us know. We'll send it out to you, and we'll hope to hear from you in the near future. All right? Enjoy your evening, and all the best with resolving this issue. We'll be only too happy to help you at some point with it. All right, good night.